In our Portraits of Discipleship that we started last week, the first lesson was just trying to define what we're doing, what we are. We started with a lot of characteristics. We just ended just shy of it, so I wanted to finish it. But the first one was that we had to deny ourselves. Secondly, we had to be willing to suffer for Christ. Third, we had to learn from Christ. And fourth, we had to bear fruit. So this one then starts into the fifth one, being that we need to love our brethren. So that's where we'll get started. Get ahead of this. Okay, so then we learn how to love our brethren. And let's make our way to John chapter 13. John chapter 13, and we're going to read verse 34. John chapter 13, verse 34. So what does John 13:34 say? What's John 13:34 say? Okay. Why is that a difficult verse to follow? And we find ourselves in two situations, because I've been thinking about this all week. Sometimes our very nature, as we deal with one another, our very nature can be more on the unlovable side. But sometimes we find ourselves in situations, and those situations can make us unlovable. Maybe we're fighting against a sin. Maybe we're just completely torn apart by a situation that's happening in our life, and it makes us very unlovable. Some people exist in a state of pain all of the time. It can make you really unlovable. Jenny will tell you how grumpy I get with a really bad headache. And so sometimes we're unlovable for a moment. Sometimes more the character of the nature of people can be unlovable. It is interesting, though, that there's not a lot of modifications made. There's not a lot of these elements talked about in the New Testament. It just tells us to what? It just tells us to love one another. So what message, and I think it's a fair message, what message should we get from that? Right. So no matter if your growing up has formed you in a way that makes it unlovable, whether you're going through something that isn't related to a sin, whether you're going through something that may be related to a sin, and maybe in those three big categories it's covered everything. But no matter what, we've still got to do what? We've still got to love one another. And because that becomes, and Jesus was often willing to separate, pull one piece out and focus on it, and then as we assemble all the pieces together, it gives us a good discussion of discipleship. In John 13:34, how important is loving one another? Jesus, it's not only a commandment. 35. We didn't read 35. That's where the answer is. Why is it so important? Because people learn that you are my disciples. So I could go and I could have great love for you guys, but when I go out into the world, everyone could hear my mouth and it be terrible. What would they find out about me? I'm a hypocrite. I'm definitely not a what? I'm definitely not a disciple. So I can go out into the world, and my speech is as manicured for righteousness as it could be. I am rightly dressed. I don't show any of these characteristics that would be unbecoming of the God. People don't see greediness in me. They don't see jealousy or envy, people who have more. But what if they see that all I do is manifest a hatred for my brethren. What's being communicated to them? I must not be a what? I must not be a disciple of Jesus. So our attitude toward each other and the way that we act toward one another, and this is a reminder for everyone, I mean, again, including me, as we interact with each other, this is a surefire way for us to understand whether or not we're disciples of His. It's so important. Another great passage in Colossians chapter 3 and 14. Colossians 3 and 14. Colossians 3 verse 14, what does it tell us to do? Why is it the bond of perfectness? What is perfectness? Let's start there. What is the bond of perfectness? It's completeness. I like thinking about it as maturity. So someone who's mature has learned how to what? Has learned how to love. Love in different circumstances, love with different characters, different personality traits. Someone who is mature has learned how to do that. Now, not everyone learns how to do that. So love is actually ends up being this bond of perfection. And when we learn that, then a church is going to be a whole lot closer joined together. And just also in 1 John chapter 4 and verse 12 and then in 20 and 21, does anyone know before you even get there what significance that has? 1 John 4, 12 and then 20 and 21. It's given to, it's kind of one of these passages that is an example in the Bible. We love because God first loved us. And how did He love us? He gave His only Son. Even though there's a bunch of people, bunches of people that don't what? They don't what? They don't believe in Him. Even if you separate out the argument, what does it take to actually follow God and what does it actually take to follow Jesus? I've mentioned this before in lessons and maybe just in your own understanding. Of the people in the world today, I guess the percentage has pretty well always been about the same. But of the people in the world today, how many of them just completely disregard God? Meaning that their devotion to something higher, whether it's themselves or whether it's something higher, what percentage of the world is it that doesn't even include God and Jesus Christ? It's surprising. 75% of the world. If you take Christianity in its largest terms, it's only how many people in the world? It's only 2 billion. Then you've got to subdivide it, of course. But 75% of the people in the world don't even acknowledge God and don't even acknowledge Jesus Christ. And yet God still what? God still loves them. And so I should be capable of still being able to love someone who steals a parking place. I should be able to still love someone and come to love someone who doesn't treat me the way that I feel like I deserve to be treated. So that's a big part of discipleship. Okay, one more. We're committed to following Jesus Christ. So again, Luke chapter 9, verse 23. And it's good that this one is the last, because maybe of all of the elements in this, the one that so many people sorely lack is the simple idea of commitment. How committed am I to be according to Luke 9, verse 23? Remember, there's three items that's used. So what three items am I looking for? Okay. If anyone wants to follow me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and then actually follow after me. So follow after me meant, we explained this last week. What does follow after me mean? It means that he listens and we respond. 1 Samuel 3 verse 10, I brought this up in the lesson. Speak, for thy servant heareth. And hearingeth means that it not just does it register, but we what? We're going to actually do it. There's also in Luke chapter 14 verse 28. What does Luke chapter 14 verse 28 tell us to do? And we've got to be very careful. Got to be very careful. What's Luke 14:28 tell us? We've got to count the cost. Count the cost. Lots and lots of young people obey Jesus Christ, and there's never a time when that's not extremely edifying, when we don't see joy in that. But they've got to understand to count the cost, because Luke chapter 9 in the 62nd verse tells us that we can't do what? Once we've decided that we want to deny ourselves, take up our cross, and follow Him, once we've counted the cost, Luke 9:62, we can't what? We can't look back, because if we look back, what happens? Then that eternal reward that God promised is only promised to people who what? Who can live it, who can continue in it, who can be faithful. And is that so unrighteous to ask? I mean, what is God? God is, there's a great sermon in that, God is, and you can list all these descriptive qualities, but one thing God is that God is faithful. And when He existed for eternity, He was always holy. And He's always going to be what? Holy. And is it too much for God to ask that when people put on Christ, that they agree to be holy, that they agree to be faithful? And if they can, if they have something to work toward, that eternal reward, if they can just maintain faithfulness. And yes, I know that faithfulness is maintained in more than one way, in a dozen or more different ways. But if they can maintain faithfulness, they become a disciple. And then as they are a faithful disciple, they can have that wonderful reward. Now, what Satan does is that Satan never lets up. So if I, as a young person, if I've decided to follow Jesus, if I have counted the cost and I am, at least as the best of my young heart's ability in that moment, never going to turn back, does Satan just give up? No. What's he going to do? He's going to try harder. So how's he going to try harder? For a young man, what's he going to throw in my way? All kinds of temptation. I don't know where it'll start. Maybe he'll throw a girlfriend in my path. Temptation. Then what's he going to throw in my path? Then what? Come on, guys. Y'all were all in my position at one time. Then what's he going to throw in my path? All my friends who want to go out drinking. Then what's he going to throw in my path? Going to, well, even before that, I was thinking about going to school. And then what will he throw in my path? Going to school. Probably all the things that already been thrown in my path, along with what else? Oh, you're so busy, you can't what? Can't be a disciple anymore. Then Charlie, get out of that, and then what does he do? Throws a family. Satan never, ever what? Gives up. He never, ever gives up. And when I look at people and I see people who are faithful disciples, I'm so grateful because they haven't given up. But I know beyond a shadow of a doubt, Satan will never give up. So whatever moment of life that you're in, whether it's a moment that's toward the beginning or a moment that is toward the end, it just depends on how I feel every day when I wake up. If I feel closer to the beginning or closer to the end, I think y'all know what I'm talking about. Satan never what? Satan never gives up. He's always got a temptation that fits exactly where you are to make you not God's disciple and to turn you into one of His disciples. So that's what we need to learn better. So we move on to today's lesson, which is thinking about our discipleship. Again, this is portraits of being a disciple. And so what we're going to do with this specific portrait is look at it as an athlete. So why does an athlete, why does that fit so well, do you think? Why does that fit so well? You got to train, you got to prepare, and then I think maybe beyond everything else, you got to do what with it? You got to stick with it. Yeah, you got to stick with it. If you are ever in any way going to be successful, and that is a lot of times what people don't do. Again, just like Luke chapter 6, verse 22, the one who looks back is not fit for the kingdom of heaven. Here's why this was such a good example. Here's why it was such a wonderful way to illustrate it. Athletics in the first century. So, the ancient Greeks were noted for their devotion to athletic games and gymnastic sports. When you think about it, they didn't have a lot of the modern distractions that we have. So what did they need? They needed ancient distractions. Distractions nevertheless, but some are modern, some are ancient. They believed that it was just as important to develop the body as it was to educate the mind. Okay? Do we still hold to that philosophy? In a humongous way, we still hold to that philosophy. Not necessarily wrong philosophy. In fact, a lot of stuff is good on the earth as long as you don't what? Yes, as long as you don't overdo it, as long as you don't overcook it. Otherwise, this is actually not bad. Just as important to take care of the body as it is to take care of the mind. The Jews, though, found them to be offensive. They thought that they were a form of idolatry because back then those games were played in honor of who? They were played in honor of the Greco-Roman gods. Okay? So they didn't care for that. Also, the games were, they thought as the games were a form of idolatry. Sorry about that. Then they trained and competed in the nude. Actually, the word for exercise, which is gymnasium, it's the word that we take and use gymnasium now, but the word in the original language basically meant to practice naked. So that's was of course highly offensive to them. But also there were 4 primary games. There were the Isthmian, the Nemean, the Pythian, and the Olympic Games. Of course, the Isthmian Games were held every 2 years outside of Corinth, and then the Olympic Games were held every 4 years. Where were those held? In Greece. They were held in Athens. So the games consisted of a whole lot of events. They had races, jumping, discus, javelin, wrestling, boxing, and contests even between heralds and trumpeters. So the point now that kind of gets to us was the training. So generally speaking, what they did was they trained 10 months out of the year. Okay, had 2 months off and trained 10 months out of the year. Ironically, who follows that rough guideline still? Who follows that rough guideline still? Some public schools, that's true, but most professional sports follow that general rule. It may not be a 10 and 2, but it's not far off from that. You know, so when in looking back in ancient times, kind of looking at that proportion to the year, they still do that. But 30 days before the event, what they did was they began to reside in one place where they exercised regularly, they followed a strict diet, they avoided luxuries, they got sufficient rest, all under constant supervision. If someone didn't do this, if they didn't participate, then they were disqualified from the games. So they took it very what? They took it very seriously. And I think that gets to such a great idea behind what we're talking about in this lesson. Okay, so these games were still extremely popular in the first century. Stadiums were built all over the Roman Empire. Crowds came to watch the contest, and because of the popularity, Paul was actually able to use it as an example because he could bring up commitment that the Lord required from his disciples. Now, what do you think the passage would be about commitment? What do you think this great passage would be about commitment? 1 Corinthians chapter 9, and let's look beginning in verse 24. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, and let's start in verse 24, because we're going to be looking at what kind of commitment do I put in. And this commitment, first of all, is I'm committed to the kind of training, the kind of rigorous training that discipleship requires. 1 Corinthians 9 verse 24, do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may obtain it. And everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a perishable crown. We do it for an imperishable crown. Therefore I run thus, not with uncertainty, thus I fight, not as one who beats the air, but I discipline my body, I bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself should be disqualified. So you've got to commit to rigorous training. Like I said, almost a year to qualify for that training. Now when you consider professional athletes, there's... You know, if a professional athlete misses one workout, you might theoretically think that that's just going to ruin them. That's actually not the way that fitness in the body works. However, it's not that much more. So for an athlete that's got to perform at the level of an Olympic athlete, how long do you think they could just lay off before it begins to affect them? How long do you think they could lay off? Only about a week or two. Only about a week or two. So think about the 100-meter dash. I almost said the 100-yard. Think about the 100-meter dash. So who owns the record for the 100-meter dash? Usain Bolt for the men. And I think the record was just set for the women. Sha'Carri Richardson, she was the one, which we will talk about, which was disqualified from the past Olympic Games. It was a big deal in the sports world. Do you remember why she was disqualified? She tested positive for marijuana use. So disqualified from the past Olympics. So I think she just set the world record in the last couple of weeks. So anyway, that record for a 100-meter dash is under 10 seconds. And usually when you've got people who are competing for that short of a distance, the difference is measured in what? Not a second, not a tenth of a second, not a hundredth of a second. Usually it's down to a thousandth of a second. So if you took 2 weeks off, and for most of us, if we enjoyed doing something and we took 2 weeks off, you get right back to it, not a big deal. But for someone who's going to compete at that level, if they lay off for 2 weeks and it causes 1/1000th of a second difference in their performance, that's the difference sometimes between what? Winning and losing. Or I'm assuming that if you're an Olympic athlete, that's the difference between third place and fourth place. And the difference between third place and fourth place is what? Somebody gets a medal and somebody doesn't. And that's a big deal. If you think about the fact that you spend years of your life being groomed for an event that's going to last about 10 seconds, you'd want to walk away with what? You'd want to walk away with a medal. Sometimes the margins are so unbelievably small. So what does Paul say in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 24? What idea does he bring up just in the 24th verse? Only one receives the prize. And what else does he bring up in verse 24? You want to run so you'll win. You'll want to run so you'll win. I've heard and I'll come back to this next week, but I've heard and this is I'm going to say a relatively new term, and sometimes when I give you guys these time frames, realize that I might miss it, because sometimes I'm just working off the top of my head. But about the last 10 years or so, I've seen the terminology of nominal Christianity, or being a nominal Christian. So what does being a nominal Christian mean? What does anything being nominal mean? If my car was in a nominal state, it doesn't what? It doesn't run. It doesn't run. So a nominal Christian is one that what? That one that just doesn't, if we could put it in car terms, a nominal Christian is one that doesn't work. When you think about the 7 churches of Asia, what the Lord said to Laodicea, and I know that this was just a figure of speech, He doesn't want a Christian who does nothing. He doesn't even want a Christian who what? Who does it halfway or is lukewarm. He wants a Christian who is, in the passage of Revelation 3, he wants a Christian who is what? Who is hot. Said another way by Paul, you need to run to win. You need to run to win. So as I run as a Christian, and I think about all of the responsibilities that are out there for God's children, I accept the fact, and I accepted it a long, long time ago, that there are so many people out there who do whatever I'm asked to do better than I can do it. So whatever you talk about, if you talk about preaching, there's a lot of people out there who preach better than I do. Bible classes, a lot of people do. If you talk about mowing the yard, there's a lot of people out there who can mow the yard better than I can mow the yard. Leading in a prayer, giving a talk around the table. There's always going to be someone better than you are at doing something. Always. But you always run to what? To win. Meaning that when you get up to do something, when you go back in a class to teach the kids, it's always what? It's always I guess you'd say, the winning attitude. Meaning that I'm going to what? I'm going to give you guys the best that I can give you in that given moment. We're all human, and the best that we can give in a moment is colored by how we feel, what we're going through, what's on our mind, what's in our heart. But nevertheless, you always run to what? You always run to win. And that's so important. It was such a wonderful concept. And I guess I hadn't thought about it until I'd seen this material. I guess I hadn't quite put it in such a strong contrasting. We gotta run to win. Yes, I know some people are going to be faster than you are. Some people are going to be faster than I am. But you've always got to run to win. So that requires something. And this is what he brings up in 26. So what does he say in 26? The first part of 26. Everyone who competes is... did I say? Oh, yeah, that's what it says right here. 25. Charlie's what? Everyone who competes for the prize is? Yeah, has self-control. All right. Now, going back to an athlete, so what does self-control mean? And it means discipline. So in an athlete, let's keep up with our 100 mile, there's people who do that, by the way. People who do that. One of the premier events in the world is called Badwater. You literally run through the Mojave Desert. You literally run through Death Valley. And it just finished about 2 weeks ago. They run you through Death Valley. It's a 135-mile foot race through the harshest environment almost on Earth. And people compete in it. So that's a lot. So anyway, back to the 100 meter one. So what do you have to do? You know, what all's involved in the 100 meter dash? When you train for it, what would revolve around your training for the 100 meter dash? Oh, so you guys had a lot of answers. Probably all of them are right. So what do you have to do? You've got to build your endurance. What else have you got to do? You've got to eat. You got to eat right. You've got to focus. And someone said build your endurance. So when you train for very short, high-intensity events, you not only have to build your endurance, but you actually have to build your speed. And building your speed and building your endurance are two very different physiological trainings. But you've still got to do both of them. Again, you got to watch what you eat. There's all kinds of things that you have to do. And I would imagine as an athlete, it's really easy to say what? Let's give up. Summer is such a great time for stuff like this, and I like riding my bicycle. So the Tour de France is going on right now. It's a little bit past the middle of it, and they were interviewing one rider a couple of days ago. So it's 21 stages. Every stage is roughly 100 miles long. So in 3 weeks' time, you ride 2,100 miles. And these are kids. These are 25-year-olds who are at the absolute peak of their physical lives. They are trained in a way that, every penny of money is thrown to give them the perfect equipment and the perfect training. And one of these kids, 2 or 3 days ago, said, look, after the first day, you don't want to get out of bed. And you've got 2 weeks and 6 days left of it. And you got to keep getting out of bed and getting on the bike and competing. And he said after the first day, you're done with it, let alone you got to go through 3 weeks of it, and it should end next week sometime. So there's unbelievable discipline that's involved. It is so easy as a disciple of Christ to think what? Some of the specific things I can think, I'll let the day go and I won't what? I won't pray, or I won't what? I won't maybe take a little Bible reading. And I've mentioned so many times because it's just been helpful for me, and if it's helpful for you, it's wonderful. As you're going to bed or as you're waking up, grab your phone and just read for about 5 minutes and reflect on it and pray before you get your day started. It's such a tiny, wonderful habit for you, but it's so easy to what? It's so easy to neglect. If you're going to run to win, we got to take these little habits and we got to start making them lifestyle changes every single day. Okay, we'll keep going next week.